was only a few short weeks ago that I made a statement to Parliament confirming the publication of Project Neptune. I made clear my intent to engage with all parties in this chamber, and noting the detailed findings of that report, all MSPs should now have received an invitation to meet with the report's authors, Ernst & Young. I also made clear the need for consultation with stakeholders. Next week I will meet with CalMac and CMAL as we begin to develop the options and next steps for reform. But crucially, as Mr Simpson alluded to in his contribution, our island communities must be part of that reform of governance structures in relation to the delivery of ferry services on the Clyde and Hebrides network. And I am pleased in that regard that Angus Campbell, who is currently the chair of the Ferries Community Board, has agreed to lead our community consultation work on Project Neptune's next step. And I'll also meet with Mr Campbell next week. Presiding Officer, I was very clear in my statement to Parliament that things have got to improve for our island communities. Now, I know there is a need for pace on next steps. That must also be coupled with respect for the staff involved. I undertook to return to Parliament to debate the next steps for Project Neptune fully, and I hope that the consensual tone that was struck in responding to that parliamentary statement will be reflected in the contributions today. As the Conservative motion notes, Project Neptune sets out the viable alternatives to the current structure, and I will work with all parties to secure that agreement on a streamlined approach which will better deliver for islanders. Presiding... Yes, I will, Mr Kerr.
Liam Kerr.
Just on that point, to ensure that the next steps are the right ones, does the Minister agree that there should be an inquiry into the ferries fiasco to find out what went wrong so it can never be repeated?
Minister.
I thank Mr Kerr for his intervention. I remind him that we have had an inquiry from the Rural Affairs Committee, I think it was in the previous Parliament. We have had an inquiry from Audit Scotland. We have had Project Neptune. We will have an inquiry from the NZEC Committee and from the Public Audit Committee. However, I understand what Mr Kerr has said in relation to further... Well, I'd like to conclude my point before Mr Mountain pops up. I understand the point that Mr Kerr is alluding to. However, all I would say to him is that there have been a number of different inquiries. And of course, in relation to the point I think he is alluding to, the Auditor General is looking in more detail. So I don't think at this time it would be appropriate for me to prejudge the outcome of his further deliberations. Mr Mountain.
Edward Mountain.
Thank the Minister for giving way. First of all, I'd like to say that as the convener of the REC Committee, when it carried out the report, it certainly wasn't aware of all the information that's currently being put in the public domain. And actually to say that we had all that information and it was available to us and we could draw conclusions is frankly wrong. The second thing is on the Net Zero Committee. The Net Zero Committee is not going to be looking, as far as I understand it, on the procurement of 801 and 802. It's going to be looking on the procurement of future ferries and the ferries plan, which you haven't updated for a considerable amount of time, Minister.
Minister, I'll give you an extra minute for taking the two interventions. Okay.
Thank you, which brings me neatly to my next point in relation to investment. Presiding Officer, as the motion calls for today and as Mr Mountain asked for, the Government has committed to a long-term plan for investment in vessels and port infrastructure, which will publish later this year as a key component of the Islands Connectivity Plan. This will build on the investments being delivered in the Infrastructure Investment Plan, which committed to £580 million of investment to provide new vessels and port upgrades. I just want to reflect on some of the progress to date in that respect. We have secured the Loch Freesa and have her operating on the Oban to Mull route. We've been through the procurement process for 2 new Isla vessels that will significantly increase capacity on the Isla route and also accelerates the replacement of the fleet. I'm also pleased to confirm that we expect the first steel to be cut on these vessels next week, on time and in line with the programme for delivery of these ships. Work is ongoing on replacement vessels for the Isle of Mull, the MV Lord of the Isles, and up to 7 vessels in the first phase of the Small Vessels Replacement Programme. But I know that additional tonnage is needed in the CalMac fleet, and we discussed this in my statement to Parliament 2 weeks ago. Officials are urgently prioritising options for ministers at the present time, and I hope to be able to say more on this in due course, noting the commercial sensitivities that are at play. I've taken already 2 substantive interventions already. Presiding Officer, I want to talk to the issue of winter resilience, which I think is also highlighted by the Conservative motion, because I know that islanders may be anxious about the coming months. And in January and February alone this year, 92.75% of cancellations were due to either weather or COVID on the CHIFS network. Therefore, to help reduce the number of delays and cancellations related to weather, we have committed to expand funding for tide and weather monitoring equipment currently in place at CMAL ports to third-party ports. As part of the consultation on the ICP, measurable performance indicators are also being developed. They will be very distinct from contractual targets and they will better reflect the real-life experience of passengers. There will also be visible and published targets against which we can monitor performance, which I think is hugely important. This year, it's also worth saying that the Government is supporting CalMac to invest an additional £5 million to improve fleet sustainability and also to give a more resilient service for passengers and for communities. Dry dock this year will be extended. That will reduce the level and risk of unplanned disruptions communities are faced with. And CalMac have also made changes to some of the vessel deployment plans to prioritise reliability and improve the quality of the service on certain routes. And for any prolonged period of disruption, I will convene resilience groups with the Ferries Community Board, CalMac and local partners, as I have done since my appointment in January. Now, I want to come to the point in relation to the ports for 801 and 802, and I know that Fergusons have today provided an update to the NZEC committee, and the Government will want to respond to that in further detail. But I want to now respond to some of the points Mr Simpson raised in relation to those ports, because I think it is quite important. Our Drawson has not been upgraded because of the delays with the private owners of the port, but this overlooks, of course, the significant investment that has taken place to ensure the vessel can operate from upgraded facilities at Troon Port. Troon has received £3 million of Scottish Government support, and that will be secured as an alternative port for the Arran service in the longer term.
Minister, you've got 30 seconds left.
In addition, the investments on the ports at the Skye Triangle means they will also be ready for 802 following the second closure period for the works at Uig. Presiding Officer, I spoke of the need for constructive working across the Chamber in relation to ferries governance and next step just weeks ago. For island businesses, for children and young people, and for all of those who depend on these lifeline services, we owe it to them to get this right. And I look forward to hearing suggestions from members today to that end. I move the amendment in my name.